Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. My name is Dr. Traci Bryn Voyles. I'm currently an associate professor in the chair of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Oklahoma. As many of you might know, I only recently moved away from Southern California, where I knew the area around UCI very, very well. Wish that we were in person. I know we all wish that we were in person, but in particular, I would have loved the opportunity to come and visit with you all because I often miss it. I'm really grateful to be here today. I particularly want to thank the Global and International Studies Department, and particularly Dr. Longbui, for the invitation to be here. I'm honored to be able to share my work with you. And I'll tell you a little bit about who I am as a scholar, how I came to this project and what the project is, but the majority of the time I'm going to spend with you today will be on a smaller piece of a book project that I've just finished working on. And the talk that I want to present to you all is called Carceral Conservation, Environmental Management in Chains at California's Salton Sea. So as I said, I'm the chair of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Oklahoma. I actually started my academic career in Southern California at the University of California, San Diego, where I received my PhD in ethnic studies in 2010. From there, I went on to complete a postdoctoral fellowship with the Mellon Environments and Societies Initiative at UC Davis. And from there, I moved just a little bit up the road from UCI to Loyola Marymount University on the west side of LA, and spent 7 years of my career there in the Women's and Gender Studies department, and also affiliated with the Environmental Studies program. Last summer, I accepted my current position and moved across the country in a pandemic. It was very dramatic. But throughout all these different kinds of pieces of my career, my primary areas of research and teaching have been in the fields of environmental justice and environmental history, critical ethnic studies, settler colonial studies and indigenous history, and gender studies and feminist theory. Though I also have published work in environmental humanities and critical disability studies as well. So the kind of work that I'm going to present to you today really emerges out of my orientation as an interdisciplinary scholar whose primary focus has revolved around questions of how power structures such as racism, nativism, settler colonialism, ableism, and patriarchy have shaped and are shaped by environmental conditions, and how the non-human world impacts and is impacted by people's experiences of oppression. So those kinds of questions at the heart of environmental justice studies and environmental history about humans' impact on nature and vice versa. My very first book, Wastelanding, came out in 2015 with the University of Minnesota Press. And that book looked at the history of uranium mining and milling on and near the Navajo Nation in the US Southwest, near the Four Corners where Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona meet. If you've ever been to the Four Corners, you kind of know what this part of the country looks like. So in that book, I argued that environmental injustice, in this case and in other cases, is produced through settler colonialism, and that settler colonialism, which is always a patriarchal and extractivist structure of power, organizes relations between humans and the non-human world in ways that produce environmentally racist outcomes. So I explored that kind of relationship through the notion of wastelanding, which was a term I coined in order to explicate racist and colonial discursive strategies of rendering certain places and peoples pollutable. My most recent book, which I've been really working on since the publication of Wastelanding, is titled The Settler Sea, California's Salton Sea and the Consequences of Colonialism. It'll be released on November 1st from the University of Nebraska Press with their Many West series. And I'm very honored to have been able to work with that press, but also with the series editors who have been really effective leaders in this process of producing this this book. And I would share the cover with you. It's not official yet, so invite me back in a couple of months and I'll show you what the book is actually going to look like. So the Salton Sea offers an environmental and indigenous history of one of California's most pressing ecological emergencies, the Salton Sea, which many of you might be familiar with by dint of living in near Southern California. So I look at this history primarily through the lens of feminist political ecology. And I do that in order to understand the ways in which the environment as a category or as an object of analysis has never been a pure, hermetically sealed category separate from human life as we often kind of imagine it to be. It has, quite to the contrary, always been integrated in and agentic in human lives. Often in inequitable kinds of ways. In turn, environmentalism has been a settler colonial as well as a heteropatriarchal political project rooted in intersectional sets of false binaries, such as humans versus nature, man versus woman, reason versus body, et cetera, and so on. Environmentalism at the Salton Sea, as a result, has been a quite fraught project, which often defies settler notions of landscapes that are worthy of protection, namely the idealization of untouched wilderness, which is a deeply gendered and racialized construct that's been at the heart of the U.S. environmental imaginary for at least about a century. So while I was doing the work that I'm going to present here today, I was living and working on Tongva land. And researching in the homelands of the Cahuilla, Kumeyaay, Quechan, and Payam-Quecham nations. I want to thank the peoples of those nations for their ecological stewardship and for the continued practices of sovereignty and self-determination in the context of ongoing settler colonialism. I would just note, and this is mostly to set up the Q&A that we'll have a chance to have, that it's incumbent on all non-native scholars, myself included, to examine and try to undo the kinds of pernicious ties between settler colonialism and higher education in the United States. So some of those kinds of connections are methodological, some of them are epistemological, and some of them are deeply material. And if you would like to talk any more about those kinds of things, about the role of land acknowledgements in talks that we give or other kinds of settings, about projects around assertions of sovereignty, in native Southern California. I would love to talk more about that and invite those kinds of questions in the Q&A, and that includes how those kinds of things play out on a Hashman land where UCI sits. I also want to say that during this talk today, I will be talking about incarceration and forms of violence that are related to carceral control, like prisons and the kinds of violences that are enacted on imprisoned people's bodies. I will not go into graphic detail about violence, but just be aware that I'll be talking about those particular forms of violence in our conversation today. So this book, The Salton Sea, revolves around a place of extreme paradox at what many writers, environmental historians, love to refer to this region where the Salton Sea sits as the end of the West, right? Which is kind of poetical, but also an interesting kind of invitation for analysis. The Salton Sea, if those of you don't know it, it is right here. I'll give you a kind of closer look at where it sits in this area. This is what it looks like from above. If you've ever heard of the Salton Sea, which some of you probably have, chances are you know three primary things about it. So first, you might know that it was created by some combination of poorly engineered irrigation systems and Colorado River flooding from 1905 to 1907, as settlers sought to turn this desert area of the Cahuillas and Kumeyaay's homeland into kind of a rich agricultural zone. The first third of my book, the first several chapters, are about interrogating the kind of origin story that we apply to the Salton Sea and whether or not it can really be accurately described, as it often is, as an accidental body of water or as a human-made body of water. Whether or not it's human-made or nature-made is up for a lot of debate often. And part of what the book does is to interrogate those kinds of conditions of its formation. The second thing that you might know about the Salton Sea is that since its formation, it's become a crucial wetland habitat for migrating birds along the Pacific Flyway. And this came to be true during a century in which California systematically destroyed over 90% of its other wetland resources for birds and other wetland dependent wildlife. According to the US Bureau of Reclamation, more birds today use the Salton Sea in winter than any other resource in the nation. And it provides a habitat for 400 different bird species. By one estimate, as many as 3.5 million individual birds use the Salton Sea on any given day, including endangered and threatened birds such as the Yuma clapper rail, the bald eagle, the California brown pelican, and the peregrine falcon, et cetera, and so on. You can kind of see how the Salton Sea kind of looks as a wildlife refuge. And then also I'll talk a little bit today about the wildlife refuge itself, which is, yes, called the Sonny Bono Salton Sea National Wildlife Refuge. And yes, it's named after that Sonny Bono. I'll tell you that story if you would like to hear it. The third thing that you might know about the Salton Sea is that it's in crisis. The sea's been sustained for nearly a century entirely on inflows of farm water runoff from the Imperial and Coachella Valley agricultural districts. So this is Imperial down here, and this is Coachella up here. This means that its water, which is so crucial to birds and other wildlife, is devastatingly polluted. So it constitutes a kind of toxic amalgam of chemicals, salts, bacteria, and heavy metals, which are all conditions that have contributed to a notorious series of fish and bird die-offs of the sea in the early 1990s and the early 2000s, from the 1990s to the early 2000s. Including one that killed 150,000 eared grebes from January to April 1992, and one that killed 7.6 million fish in a single day in August of 1999. So if you Google the Salton Sea, some of the images that first come up are these kinds of images of die-off and decay, making it seem like a landscape that's unworthy of protection by virtue of being so dangerous to wildlife. So it's these kinds of tensions about how we regard it as important or dangerous that I'm interested in really interrogating. So the book, the broader framework of the book examines the ways that settlers have maintained, shaped, managed, and mismanaged the non-human world writ large, using the Salton Sea as a microcosm or a case study. The book argues that colonizers have systematically restructured physical landscapes in ways that exert and reinforce processes that are part and parcel of colonial power relations in the United States. So in a sense, the history of the Salton Sea can most clearly be understood, according to my analysis, as a physical manifestation of settler colonial power. So settler colonialism, in turn, can be tracked in terms of its physical consequences on landscapes as well as on people, and particularly on indigenous peoples. When I use the phrase settler colonialism, what that refers to is a set of power relations that seeks to colonize indigenous peoples and claim their homelands as settlers' own through intersecting forces of racism, sexism, heteronormativity, environmental degradation, dispossession, ableism, and capitalism. So in other words, settler colonialism is generally not used or theorized as always a binary power relation with unilateral impacts from white settler to native, but rather a web of relationships that reinforces white supremacy, control over land, exploitation of racialized workers, and unsustainable resource use for capitalist accumulation. So in the book, I talk about kind of the manifold impacts and implications of settler colonialism as a power structure as really falling out in terms of indigenous dispossession, of course, but also nationalist enclosure, and the nativism and xenophobia that goes along with nationalist enclosure, and racial capitalism and hyper-exploitation of non-white laborers, as well as environmental degradation, kind of all of those processes working together. So here, in this part of the kind of the framing of the book, I argue that part of these processes has entailed entrapping nature to do settlers' work for them. So in the So today I'll talk about how the Salton Sea's history has been wrapped up in strange and often very surprising interconnections between conservation and corrections in California in the 20th and 21st centuries. This, just to give you another kind of sense of place and history, this is a map of indigenous homelands in current day California. The Salton Sea occupies a portion of the lake bed of Lake Cahuilla. One of the things that I won't have time to explore in depth today, but is a major part of the book, are the ways in which the Salton Sea is really just a current day manifestation of long histories of bodies of water in this part of the desert. So while it's been mismanaged by settlers in ways that have created its deeply troubling conditions, water in the desert isn't itself the problem. Water in the desert has been a central part of the region's environmental history through deep geologic time up through the present. But you can see here the Kumeyaay's homeland overlapping the area where Lake Cahuilla, the lake bed of Lake Cahuilla is, as well as the Cahuilla Nation and Quechans. I would also just quickly point out that this map artificially bisects the Cahuilla and Quechan nations. In reality, they extend past what's currently the international borderline there. By the late 20th century, this corner of the Sonoran Desert in Southern California had been transformed into what I think of as a deeply carceral landscape. Along with a startling number of California's rural areas, this part of the Cahuillas and Kumeyaay's homeland had come to host vast complexes of barbed wire and poured concrete that were designed to cage hundreds of thousands of people, most of them non-white. As Ruthie Wilson Gilmore has documented meticulously, and particularly in her germinal work, Golden Gulag, California's 20th century political economy came to be warped around and by this kind of complex industry of policing, caging, and surveilling its residents. Here in the Cahuillas and Kumeyaay's homeland, this carceral industrial complex manifested itself in the construction of more than a dozen state prisons and detention facilities. And I'll talk about some of the differences between the different kinds of forms of incarceration or manifestations of incarceration here in just a little bit. One of these prisons, Calipatria State Prison, which is right here, opened in 1992 and quickly assumed the dubious distinction of being California's most overcrowded prison in a state that is deeply troubled by this problem of overcrowding in prisons. And one of the first prisons that had to resort to what's referred to as double celling the people incarcerating there, which means doubling the capacity of cells and other kind of living spaces within prisons. The next year, the year after it opened, California would assume an even more notorious distinction. It would come to host the first of California's newest experiments in carceral control, which was an electrified fence that would carry enough volts of electricity to instantly kill any person who touched it. This was almost immediately nicknamed the death fence, and it was part of the state of California's attempts to find more efficient ways of controlling populations of people who were incarcerated in its various institutions throughout the state. At Calipatria, guards threw the switch on what was called the death fence in early November of 1993. It was almost immediately met with this international outcry. It had lots of bad press from journalists around the country, as well as in other countries like France and Germany. And this outcry wasn't because of the kinds of human rights violations that were built into or implied in the purpose of the death fence, but rather because this technology of carceral control, which promised the demise of people, actually turned out to be incredibly dangerous to birds and other wildlife. So in response to this bad press, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and throughout the talk, I'll call that the CDCR, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, responded by collaborating with ornithologists and the State Fish and Wildlife Agency to alter and adapt the fence in order to save birds in ways that still maintained its lethality to humans. So they spent about a year coming up with different kinds of ways in which they could keep birds from basically dying on the death fence. Their eventual solution came complete with burrowing tunnels underneath the fence for owls, duck ponds that they put outside the fence line to entice waterfowl away from it, and draping this kind of tough netting over the top of it so that it would be strong enough to save a bird's life if it perched on top, but still pliable enough that an escaping person would still fall to their death. Historian Mike Davis dubbed this death fence adaptation in his classic study of Southern California landscape and culture, Ecology of Fear. He called it the world's first ecologically sensitive death fence. So if all of this feels bizarre, right, all of these attempts to save birds while also corralling and controlling and caging people, if all of it feels strange, it should. The partnerships that were forged during this time between state government agencies to do things like build bird conserving death fences reflected long-standing but very difficult to see patterns that connected conservation and corrections in the state's history. Protecting birds from a death fence that was designed to kill humans might seem at first blush like maybe a logical stance for mainstream conservation organizations. So if we're going to take this position, maybe we say, after all, they seek to care for the environment and not people. I would argue, and a lot of folks in the environmental justice literature would argue, that this perspective on environmentalism emerges from a particular kind of environmental politics, one that sees human welfare as at best secondary to ecological conditions, and at worst a distraction from conservation of wildlife and other kinds of resources. Even if we presuppose this claim, which I'm not arguing that we do, but even if we presuppose the claim that environmentalists can, should, and do care about plants and animals in a way that silos them off from humans and larger ecologies, those who are concerned about environmental quality siloed from human life would find much about prisons troubling. Prisons are devastating ecological vandals. They produce the same kinds of ecological impacts as other highly dense communities of people, but with considerably less stringent regulation. They require vast inputs of resources and energy and produce even vaster outputs of air pollution, chemical waste, solid waste, and sewage. Prison factories discharge toxic chemicals into local air, water, and soil. And in California, the state prison system has been charged with multiple major water pollution problems, including at one time a 700,000 gallon sewage spill from Folsom Prison in 1989 that ran directly into the Sacramento River watershed. Prisons have been fined for falsifying reports on hazardous waste emissions and failing to update infrastructure for properly disposing of noxious effluent. Despite the fact that prisons have been exempted from a number of state and federal regulations on the use and disposal of hazardous waste products and chemicals, between 2013 and 2018, federal and state environmental agencies still made more than 1,300 charges against prisons across the country for violating the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. Environmental impacts, of course, go both ways. Even as prisons create environmental problems for their surrounding areas, imprisoned people are literally barred from escaping dangerous environmental conditions that come from the outside in. So there were a number of examples of the ways in which environmental contexts outside the walls of prisons actually impact the interior environmental conditions. Just a few of them are cases of arsenic contaminated water in California prisons, to radon gas exposure in a Connecticut prison, air pollution from toxic ash in a prison that was sited above a coal mine in Kentucky, In all of these different kinds of examples, prisons have been seething sites of environmental injustice, whether they're recognized as such or not. This, for example, is an annual report that was produced in 2018 by the Global Environmental Justice Project, which is at UC Santa Barbara, that explored many of these kinds of cases of really seething environmental injustices that are happening in places of incarceration. Climate change doesn't help matters. Blistering heat waves in places like rural California, inland California, expose imprisoned people to the dangerous realities entailed in climate change. Of the 5 CDCR facilities that are most vulnerable to extreme heat events, 4 of them, Centinela, Calipatria, Ironwood, and Chequala state prisons, sit just within miles of the Salton Sea. Climate change has already increased the number of days of extreme heat in this part of the state, and most CDCR prisons rely solely on outdated evaporative cooling systems rather than something like central air that by the agency's own admission don't really work. So you can imagine how those sorts of extreme heat events get experienced in the desert in a place with no air conditioning. Fences and barbed wire, including Calipatria's death fence, make fleeing these kinds of conditions a death sentence. So in the chapter that this talk is based on, the chapter of the book, I really wanted to probe these kinds of connections. I wanted to ask questions about how historians can trace the shared histories of incarceration and environmental conservation. I wanted to ask how these forces have been co-produced, even as very deeply entrenched worldviews have seen one as a human history, so the prisons and social control, and the other as a natural history of ecosystems and wildlife management. In what ways can and should environmentalists make common cause with prison abolitionists and calls in solidarity with the movement for Black lives to defund the police? What are the environmental politics entailed in those kinds of movements? In turn, and along these lines, how can critical analyses of white supremacy unpack and address the environmental consequences of anti-Black racism, nativist xenophobia, and settler colonial indigenous dispossession, and so on? Those are the kinds of questions that I was most interested in asking. I came to the subject that were at the heart of this talk about incarceration and conservation largely by accident. So after all, who would think that an environmental history of the Salton Sea would have anything to do with the California Department of Corrections? It certainly wasn't something that I anticipated having a chapter about in the book. But this part of the book emerged through what's a tried and true historical methodology of accidentally finding unexpected things in the archive. As I researched how roads were built around the Salton Sea, for example, to bring in tourists, this was a major site of tourism in the 1950s and 1960s, to bring tourists or to carry out produce from the Imperial and Coachella Valley farms, I learned that the rocks that the roads were made of were blasted from local hills by unfree laborers in prison camps who were sent there for things like drunken driving or being drunk and disorderly. The asphalt itself was then laid one boilingly hot mile after the next by unfree laborers on chain gangs. So these were some of the kinds of things that began to emerge as I did my research. In my exploration of the violent forms of dispossession and genocide that followed white settlers through California and to the California desert, I noticed the frequency with which white settlers resorted to public lynchings as a state-sanctioned yet uncodified form of policing Native men and boys. It was another piece of the research that emerged that I didn't necessarily expect. As I examined the history of the reservation system that removed Native people from the area surrounding the Salton Sea to smaller pieces of their homeland on reservations, I learned that the first buildings that the federal agents demanded that they build on their reservations weren't homes or schools, but jails. And that finding ways to incarcerate other Native people was one of the first steps in what federal agents would call the civilizing mission. This is one of those jails. This is on the Cahuilla Reservation. This young man here, who was about, I think 12 or 13 at the time these images were taken, is named Condino Lubo. He's a member of the Kuya Nation. And what he's doing is just playing with his friend, right, as kids do, in front of what was the jail that was demanded to be built by the Kuyas, by the Federal Indian Service. The final piece of evidence that made it clear that I needed to add a whole chapter to the book came when I was researching one of the Salton Sea's first massive fish die-offs. And this one occurred in June of 1970. So this die-off resulted in thousands and thousands of dead corvinas, croakers, and sargos that washed up onto the beach and began to decay under the glare of the desert hot sun, right? You can imagine fish bodies out there in the desert. One Fish and Wildlife employee describes standing on the shoreline and watching these flotillas of dead fish on the surface of the sea floating in, and he described them as being like solid rafts that were out in the middle of the sea and headed toward the shoreline. So this wasn't the first of the seasonal die-offs of fish, but it would be the worst, and it would foreshadow decades of similar events that were to come. So in 1970, state officials had to deal for the first time with one of these massive, very, very large scale fish die-offs, and particularly with the problem of how to remove these solid rafts of decaying fish bodies from the Salton Sea's beaches. They did so, as I was surprised to find out during my research, with incarcerated workers who collectively spent 300 hours cleaning the beaches of the rotting fish that had floated in from the middle of the sea. All of these workers came from Southern California prison camps, which in the 1970s in California employed incarcerated people in a wide range of conservation-related jobs. When they weren't trampling over miles of beach to gather up rotting fish carcasses, these imprisoned laborers weeded stream beds, they cut fire lines, they cleared flood debris, maintained trails and roads, fumigated forests for insect infestations, they managed nurseries, they dredged canals, they did all sorts of the more or less every different kind of conservation work that's entailed in wildlife refuge management or state conservation lands. When they weren't on location at these sites doing conservation work, they lived at former civilian conservation corps camps that had been taken over by the state government, and they were nicknamed honor camps. Honor camps housed incarcerated adults and youth wards of the state. From 1946 to 1957, which was one of the periods of most intensive growth of the honor camp program. The program grew from a single youth program to 7 youth camps, 15 adult camps that were operated in partnership by the Departments of Correction and the Department of Forestry. So Corrections and Forestry were working together. Including 6 seasonal camps that were run in conjunction with the Federal Forest Service and 3 highway camps. What you can see here is that this is a CDCR map of the conservation and ecology centers, which are they're called ecology centers, where conservation work was being run by incarcerated workers. California state officials were super proud of the successes of this program. So in their eyes, they saw that it utilized what they described, this is their quote, not mine, the quote, idle manpower wasted in prisons, unquote. The honor camps, according to the state, accompanied any number of positive ends. So as they described them, again, their words, not mine, quote, economy in prison operation, great quantities of valuable conservation work at economical cost, and most of all, an inestimable good in human rehabilitation, end quote. For all of these reasons, the state's Department of Forestry anticipated in 1957 that the honor camp program will certainly, quote, long occupy a respected place of California state governance, end quote. In 1959 alone, the California legislature authorized more than $4 million to be spent on conservation camp construction. The governor at the time, Pat Brown, who's the father of Jerry Brown, said that he believed that prisoners would benefit from a healthy outdoor lifestyle, as he called it. It also likely did not hurt that their labor cost the state no more than $2.50 per laborer per day. All across California, these workers weeded stream beds, they cut fire lines, they did all of this kind of landscape management sort of work. As you can see, just across the breadth of California. By 1966, the number of incarcerated people in conservation camps in California had increased 5 times over. Pat Brown adored the program. He talked about it a lot. He was really interested, particularly in advertising the fact that it helped the state develop nearly 150,000 new acres for outdoor recreation for non-incarcerated people. So incarcerated people were doing the labor and non-incarcerated people were using the areas that they conserved for recreation. By 1970, the forestry and the corrections departments, along with the state's youth authority, were running 33 sites that employed 2,500 incarcerated minors and adults to fight fires and conserve the state's natural resources. As the program expanded across California, you can kind of see these are the sorts of early firefighting activities that were done by incarcerated firefighters. As the program expanded across California, incarcerated workers contributed meaningfully to the material world around the Salton Sea in ways that went beyond either firefighting or clearing beaches of rotten fish. Puerto La Cruz Conservation Camp and La Sima Conservation Camp Center both opened in 1957 in the mountains to the west of the sea and kind of the highlands that surrounds and encircles the Salton Sea. By the early 1970s, the California Department of Corrections was running the majority of the state's conservation camps and ecology centers. So like these two camps, Puerto La Cruz and La Cima, the 8 that were located in Southern California, mostly clustered in the kind of the western reaches of the Colorado and Mojave deserts and in these kinds of remote mountain outposts. State officials bragged that the people incarcerated in the camps rarely attempted escape, which is a situation that they attributed to the recuperative effects of strenuous labor in nature, which is a kind of long-standing trope in the West that strenuous labor in nature can heal what ails you in many different kinds of ways. But perhaps a more likely interpretation of the infrequency of escape attempts was that the camps sat in rough landscapes that were far removed from cities and towns. In essence, these really remote kinds of areas and the landscapes themselves functioned as a helpmate to or a replacement for iron bars, walls, and chains. In ways that echoed other forms of incarceration in harsher, forbidding places, the environment itself intensifies these people's experiences of incarceration. In autumn of 1976, 13 youths from one of these Southern California camps. So these teenagers came from the Oak Glen Youth Conservation Camp in Riverside County. They arrived in Coachella Valley, which was the heart of the Desert Cahuillas homeland just to the north of the Salton Sea, to dig out more than 200 homes from flood debris after these really bad rainstorms. For this work that they engaged in, they earned 75 cents a day. And on most days while they were there, their labor involved cutting fire trails. In this instance, they spent their time and energy hauling wheelbarrows full of mud mixed with the detritus of people's flood-wrecked homes. And what newspaper articles like this do is they often kind of situate these laborers in terms of that theme or trope of rehabilitation and recuperation, particularly by centering the stories of non-incarcerated people who are talking about how well-behaved and polite these workers doing conservation labor are. So I can talk more about those kinds of tropes and framings that come about in newspaper accounts of these projects. At the Salton Sea Wildlife Refuge itself, which is here, imprisoned workers came to be key to the functioning of a resource for the Salton Seas, of the refuge as a resource for the Salton Sea's wild bird populations. Very quickly after its formation, as I said in the intro, the sea came to support more than 400 bird species. It's been a really crucial feature of wildlife conservation, particularly for birds throughout the Southwest, but particularly in California. Contrary to romantic notions about what a wildlife refuge might entail, and particularly notions of refuges as slices of untouched nature. Refuges are actually environments of intense human management. State and federal agents cultivate the plant and animal worlds of refuges. They deploy fertilizers and pesticides. They grow rows of crops. They control water flows with drainage and irrigation infrastructure. They install and maintain plumbing and sewage, erect buildings. They pave roads, all of these different kinds of things to create a kind of enticing environment for wildlife. By the 1990s, the chronically underfunded Fish and Wildlife Service had turned out of necessity to the cheapest source of labor it could get, and that was imprisoned workers. In 1990, refuge managers estimated that prisoners had undertaken more than 1,500 hours of work. They raked troublesome stands of salt cedar out of ponds. They built a visitor observation tower. You can actually see that here. It was either this one or like this one. They installed drainage pipes, cleared ditches, and pruned trees and shrubs. The following year, they more than doubled their workload, contributing 3,600 hours doing the most time-consuming, labor-intensive work on the refuge. Year after year in the early 1990s, workers arrived at the refuge in January after fire season had passed and remained there until March, coming primarily from a camp called Mccain Valley Conservation Camp, which was a minimum security state prison in Boulevard, California. These imprisoned workers tackled the refuge's most labor-intensive projects and really did the work that made the refuge tenable in this part of California, given their labor shortages from other kinds of sources. Mccain Valley, I just want to show you what the logo looks like. This is the logo for McCain Valley. In the 1990s, it was among the newest of the state's carceral conservation programs. And I just want to point out that the camp's logo brings together the iconography of the American West, most notably the pioneer wagon that you can see here. But it also brings together this iconography with perhaps Southern California's most recognizable image of conservation, which is the windmills that you see if you drive east toward the desert. Like those that stand in groves outside of Palm Springs. So over this updated version of westward expansion, the pioneer wagon and the windmills, there's a raven that looks like it's about to attack someone. So these kinds of themes of conservation and westward expansion sort of coming together in this system of incarceration. Like other incarcerated conservation workers, the laborers from McCain Valley at the refuge split their time between providing labor for various state agencies like Fish and Wildlife and fire management, right? They often had to prioritize fire management. By the early 2000s, as many of you might know, and as climate change caused temperatures to get higher and higher in California year after year, firefighting had become an incredibly urgent task for the state, and it increasingly became a more dangerous one as drought conditions made wildfires more intense from one season to the next. Of the 20 largest fires in the state history up to 2019, 15 ignited in the 2000s. By the end of those first two scorched decades of the 21st century, nearly 4,000 imprisoned people had been sent to labor on fire lines across California. They often make $1 an hour on active fires and under $2 a day doing fire prevention work, such as laying fire lines. These workers describe their time on the fire line as frightening, grueling, unpredictable, and exhausting. One man was interviewed by a researcher in 2012 and said, quote, "This is legalized slavery, that's all it is," end quote. Whereas their civilian counterparts underwent 3 years of apprenticeship to become firefighters, prisoners headed out to confront unpredictable blazes in drought conditions with a meager 2 weeks of fire safety and suppression training. All told, in any given year in the 2010s, imprisoned laborers provided up to 10 million person hours fighting fires and undertaking other kinds of conservation-oriented work. The CDCR bragged in 2010 that the program saved the state $80 million a year. This program, which linked incarceration, public lands, fire, and conservation, presented some really troubling ironies, of course. California's ecosystem, far from being a pure wilderness that would best thrive if only humans could learn to, quote, leave no trace, has been managed and maintained for centuries by indigenous nations that used fire as a central technology to care for landscapes from the Sierra Nevada to the coasts and deserts. Throughout California, Native peoples deployed fire since time immemorial as a mediator of their human relations to their non-human world. As settlers then privatized California lands or brought them under state control as public lands, settler environmental management practices, from conservation and preservation on refuges and parks to exploitation in mines, urban areas, ranches, and farms, focused on what was called uncompromising fire suppression. The dispossession of Native people from their homelands had direct material consequences for ecosystems that depended on regular controlled burns to thrive. While these settler environmental mismanagement schemes caught landscapes up in fire suppression, the laborers who undertook the hot and difficult and dangerous work of firefighting were likewise caught up in a settler system of incarceration. So these kinds of ironies that are really symbolized nowhere so clearly as in the confrontation between an imprisoned person and a wall of flames were present on the Salton Sea's northern beaches in the summer of 1970 as they gathered fish bodies that drifted to the shore to rot, and in other kinds of components of the Salton Sea's environmental past. Here you can see some of the firefighting scenes. These are contemporary incarcerated workers working fire lines in one of the state's recent wildfires. Decades of mismanagement of the state's natural resources and mismanagement of the conditions at the Salton Sea made it so that control over water resources and farmlands in places like the Imperial Valley and Coachella Valley all had these sorts of cumulative effects in the environmental history of the sea itself. The employment of prison laborers to undertake cleanups, for example, or for that matter, to dredge fire lines through drying and overgrown foothills, functioned in essence as a settler answer to a settler problem. So by way of conclusion, and before I have a chance to answer your questions during a Q&A session, I want to return to one of the central questions of the book. And this question emerges in part from the history of conservation and incarceration that I've laid out in this talk. And that question is, what does this all tell us about environmental justice? So I argue that if landforms like the Salton Sea function in ways that maintain and advance the dispossessive and exploitative nature of settler colonialism, this fact extends and expands what we can think of as cases of environmental injustice. So when environmental conditions exacerbate existing social inequities, as for example happens around the Salton Sea when evaporation exposes nearby communities, including incarcerated people, to like noxious dust storms, when these kinds of things happen, they become part of the structure of people's experiences of oppression. When social inequities contribute to harm that gets done against non-humans in the environment, as for example, when endangered birds die on a death fence designed to kill or control incarcerated humans, they become part of the many ways in which human action degrades environmental quality. Each of these functionalities expand and transform the field of what we understand to be environmental injustices. Environmental injustice can thus include more commonly studied examples such as racist patterns and toxic waste siting, but also can be used as a framework to analyze a wide range of sites and scales, from the network of dams that alternately flood and desiccate native lands throughout the West, to the impacts on wild fish and birds of racial capitalism and agricultural labor. All of these different kinds of ways give us new frameworks for analyzing the relationships between social injustices and environmental harm. It also, for that matter, transforms what we might imagine that environmental justice looks like, and particularly environmentally just futurities. What I want to present in the book as a whole, and in this smaller piece of it here in this talk, is not a state or a teleological narrative of environmental decline in which humans endlessly and universally destroy nature, which is a common complaint lodged against environmental historians that we're just interested in telling stories about the ways in which humans have destroyed the world around them. I want to make a more nuanced argument that involves the ways in which the functions of social power, such as racism, sexism, classism, heteropatriarchy, and ableism, are themselves environmentally ruinous. So in this formulation, the oppression of humans is itself a primary threat to the non-human world. So this book, The Settler Sea, is as I hope this talk hints at, this book is about a fragile world. But the part of it that's fragile isn't necessarily the Salton Sea itself, but rather the ways in which different human communities have managed it and the landscapes that surround it. The Salton Sea's contemporary current day precariousness, the way it sits uncomfortably between worlds at the moment, existing always at the interstices of human and natural influences between a desert and a wetland, between evaporation and the constant inflow of polluted water, all of these ways in which it has a kind of interstitial current day existence. All of that is wrapped up as both a symptom and a symbol of the larger precariousness of settler relationships to the environment in California and beyond California. So that's it for this talk. I really look forward to your questions, and thank you so much for your time and attention.